Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something really exciting. We're unpacking the mental models of one of the most influential, wealthy, and honestly fascinating figures in modern history. Yep, we're talking about Bill Gates. We're drawing directly from an incredibly candid recent interview he gave, and we're going to break down exactly how he views the world today. We'll be looking at his thoughts on global innovation, the absolutely massive shifts happening in the tech landscape right now, and the intensely personal habits that have actually driven his success.
You know, to really understand Bill Gates today, you kind of have to understand who he was when he first started out. In this really raw, unfiltered reflection on his early career, he completely owns up to being a total maniac. He'd pull these crazy 72-hour stints in the office before finally crashing. His philosophy? Well, if you're in a race, your 20s are the time to absolutely harness that relentless adrenaline and just outwork everyone around you.
So how exactly does a tech maniac evolve into a global philanthropist? Well, here is our roadmap for today. First, India's innovation ecosystem. Second, the AI revolution. Third, rethinking wealth and philanthropy. And finally, number 4, the lifelong student.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, India's innovation ecosystem, and how it completely shifted from just exporting talent to becoming a massive innovation hub.
So Gates has basically had a front row seat to India's tech evolution for decades now. Back in the 80s and 90s, he points out that Microsoft heavily hired brilliant minds from India and moved them over to the US. And fun fact, that move actually made both the US and Indian governments a little mad at the time. But as we move into the 2000s, a lot of those brilliant minds returned home to create Microsoft India. Fast forward to today, and the landscape is completely unrecognizable. Gates isn't just looking at India for software anymore. His foundation is on the ground, actively partnering there to invent better vaccines, stronger agricultural seeds, and cutting-edge AI healthcare tools.
When you ask him why India has become this global talent capital, literally producing world-class CEOs like Satya Nadella and Sundar Pichai, Gates points to a few very specific ingredients. First off, you start with 20% of the world's population. That's a fifth of humanity. Then you add a deep cultural emphasis on engineering and software, and you filter all of that through incredible university ecosystems like the IITs. But the real secret sauce here, Gates calls it a magic combination. It's finding leaders who are absolutely top-tier at engineering, but equally brilliant at management.
And this just brilliantly illustrates how far India has actually come. Gates points out that India is now leading on the global stage through something he calls South-South facilitation, because India has successfully built these frugal, highly effective digital public infrastructures, think systems like digital identity and digital money. The Gates Foundation is actually funding African nations to travel over to India. They learn from these open source systems, and then they take that knowledge to implement them back home. It's truly a game changer.
All right, let's shift gears and move to Section 2, the AI revolution, and navigating the next technological frontier. Let's see how the guy who helped put a computer on every desk views this current AI explosion.
It's really fascinating to see the stark contrast between Gates's early days and what's happening right now. Back when he was pioneering personal computing, he was part of this tiny, almost isolated group of innovators, facing a public that literally thought they were crazy. The field was completely wide open, but the AI era, it is a totally different beast. It's flooded with massive global investment and fierce competition. Gates even notes that some of the best AI models we've seen in recent months have come from Chinese companies that most people barely even knew existed. So his takeaway? It is significantly tougher to get out in front today than it was back in the 1980s.
So, the million-dollar question, how do you and I actually survive this revolution? Well, Gates' prescription is super clear. You don't necessarily need a deeply mathematical mind to build the underlying architecture of AI. Honestly, that's going to be left to a very narrow, specialized set of engineers. But, and this is a big but, if you do any sort of creative work, you absolutely must bridge the gap between AI and your specific industry. Adapting these tools into your daily workflow, it's just no longer optional. You have to become a power user.
Now, Gates is also a very grounded realist. Alongside all its incredible potential, shaping AI properly actually sits at the very top of his short, terrifying list of global existential threats. He warns that AI's potential to become smarter than humans requires extremely careful shaping. In fact, he places it on the exact same threat level as avoiding the next pandemic, nuclear war, bioterrorism, and climate change. Serious stuff.
Okay, before we pivot to how he's using his immense wealth to fight those very threats, let's take a quick breather and look at who inspires the man himself. If he could invite any 3 Indians, dead or alive, to dinner, who would make the cut?
As you might guess, his choices span across history and industry, though he totally admits it's basically impossible to narrow it down to just 3.
He mentions Prime Minister Narendra Modi specifically to understand his vision for the year 2047. He also lists the great scientist Raj Paun, the legendary industrialist and philanthropist Ratan Tata, and the historical mathematical genius Srinivasa Ramanujan. Actually, Gates describes Ramanujan's abilities as almost mysterious, which is pretty high praise coming from him.
And that brings us to Section 3, Rethinking Wealth and Philanthropy, and the business of giving it all away. Let's unpack the philosophy driving the largest private foundation in the entire world.
1%. Just let that sink in for a second. In a world where massive wealth is almost always passed down from generation to generation, this number represents a truly radical departure. Gates reveals that his children will inherit less than 1% of his total wealth. Why? Well, because he firmly believes that leaving them billions of dollars wouldn't actually be doing them a favor. The tech sector, as he points out, is uniquely aggressive about dismantling its fortunes rather than building these multi-generational dynasties. He genuinely wants his kids to have the chance to be significant on their own 2 feet without being constantly overshadowed by his own incredible luck and fortune.
So you're probably wondering, where does the other 99% go? Well, it goes towards solving massive human problems, and it's all driven by a very simple concept most of us learned in childhood: the golden rule. Treating people like you'd like to be treated. Gates actually uses this exact phrasing to express his deep disappointment that many wealthy nations, including the US, are currently cutting their foreign aid budgets for the poorest countries.
And listen, his foundation isn't just throwing money at problems and hoping for the best. They are hunting absolute eradication. Gates boldly states that he expects to completely eradicate polio from the face of the earth within the next 5 years. If they pull this off, it will be only the second disease in human history to be wiped out, right after smallpox back in 1980. In step 2, they plan to use that massive momentum and credibility to go after malaria and measles next.
Finally, let's move to Section 4, the lifelong student. We're going to zoom all the way inside the mind's evolution to look at the personal habits, the regrets, and the fears of the man behind all of this.
The contrast between the young founder and the modern philanthropist is just fascinating. Think about it. At 25, he had this razor-narrow focus on software and ran on endless adrenaline. Today, approaching 70, his focus is incredibly broad, tackling massive things like global health and AI. He relies heavily on accumulated wisdom to compensate for, a slight reduction in raw processing power. But right alongside this wisdom lies his biggest personal fear: cognitive decline. He openly admits he will be deeply sad as his brain eventually becomes less capable, simply because he just loves learning so much.
And he is also incredibly open about his failures. When asked about his biggest, most public mistake, he points straight to the mobile phone operating system. He flat out acknowledges that Microsoft completely missed the window there, allowing Android to swoop in and take the dominant position. It's a pretty powerful reminder that even the most successful, brilliant strategists on Earth make monumental, billion-dollar miscalculations.
So how exactly does he keep pushing forward despite those mistakes and the constantly changing tech landscape? Well, he points to one ultimate success habit: being a lifelong student. His advice is to read constantly. But more importantly, he says you have to be brutally honest with yourself about whether you truly understand the concepts you're reading about. You have to build your knowledge carefully so that it all connects together like a giant puzzle.
When asked what he wants written next to his name in the history books, Gates totally rejects the idea of a personal epitaph. Instead, he points to this idea right here. He wants future generations to open a book, see the word polio, and have absolutely no idea what it means. He wants to prove that humanity has the capacity to actually finish a problem, definitively, and just move on.
Which naturally brings us right back to you. Based on all the mental models we've explored today, ask yourself, are you spending your early career being a maniac about your goals, outworking the competition while you have the energy and the chance? And maybe more importantly, are you cultivating those brutal, lifelong study habits required to adapt when the AI revolution inevitably turns your industry upside down? Think about that as you apply these lessons to your own life. And with that, that wraps up today's Explainer. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.